the corpse of Osiris, the 13 pieces of Osiris, a giant obelisk, facing her womb, just like the obelisk faces the womb in Washington, D.C., where the dome and the obelisk in Washington now are ready for the metaphysical ritual to be performed in secret by the elite that's going to bring the ultimate incarnation. Everything up until now, perhaps, has just been, a practice ceremony to make sure they're prepared. And the magic ceremony, the raising of Osiris from the dead, has been rehearsed and ritualized in the Herodome by the Supreme Council of Washington, D.C., with every passing United States president, beginning with, posthumously, with George Washington, in anticipation of the ultimate future incarnation of Osiris and Apollo. Now, I'm going to tell you something, Steve. Dan Brown, he puts out this book, The Lost Symbol.
Right.
And he talks a little bit, well, actually the opening scene in his book has to do with a 32nd degree Freemason being raised to the 33rd. The reason they use that terminology, in fact, the ritual itself, according to all of the, the greatest writers of Freemasonry, Albert Pike, all of them, Mackey, they all talked about how the raising ceremony is a parody of the raising of Osiris. Now, they call it Harem Abif, but they all admit that it's actually just a thinly veiled covering for the mysticism involved in the raising of the spirit of Osiris. Where you look at Dan Brown's book, the opening scene, you get a 32nd degree Freemason. He's going to go through the raising ceremony in the 33rd, in the House of the Temple in Washington, D.C., which parodies the raising of Osiris from the dead. When I was doing research, which wound up being almost 7,000 pages of research 2 years ago, and then last year my book came out, Apollyon Rising 2012, talking about all this, I was very curious about something I had been told. A lobbyist for a particular politician, I can't name either one of them, but it doesn't matter because the facts stand on their own, told me that the raising ceremony is conducted in the House of the Temple not just when a 32nd degree Freemason reaches 33rd degree, but is also conducted in secrecy every time a U.S. president is inaugurated. The reason I went to Washington, D.C., and met with two members of the 33rd degree Freemasonry and took another person with me, the reason that I went was to ask that particular question. Now, I talked to them about a lot of other stuff while I was there, and I was there for hours, and they were they were willing to answer any question that I wanted to ask them, but I got to tell you, well, I'll just tell you, the person that was with me was Nita, my wife, and she'll tell you that when I asked them, okay, I have been told that the raising ceremony is conducted at the inauguration of every United States president. And if that's true, the only reason behind that would be that you are practicing Rosicrucian Freemasonic mysticism in which you are invoking the raising of the spirit of Osiris into every U.S. president in the same way that the Egyptians did with the pharaohs. Now, is that true or is it not true? Steve, that was the only question. Neither of those guys would answer that question. They just wouldn't answer it.
That would be after you said that, I was going to say, what was the question that made him the most nervous? Well, obviously, that's the million-dollar question, and silence, is tantamount to absolute verification of your statement.
Well, they just wouldn't answer it. So they didn't say it was true, but they didn't say that it wasn't true. And if you look at everything in Washington, D.C., frankly, to use street language, you'd have to be a buffoon not to understand that they would in fact, based on everything they already do, based on the way the city is laid out, all of the constructs there are for the purpose of raising the spirit of Osiris. Everything there is for that purpose. Now, when you look at these, and I realize we're within a few minutes of 1 hour, so I will try to move.
Start hearing the music. We've got a 3-minute break at the top of the hour, I think, but then we go for good with 60 minutes uninterrupted. So,
all right, and we can spend the whole second hour on the number 72.
Yeah, I would like to do that because I think it's so critical. I mean, people have got to understand, it's not Tom and Steve just sitting here. This is the stuff that Daniel, when essence, was probably shown, but this is sealed up, and the event is determining the time, if all of the gates are becoming active, if in Oman we're seeing the very basis of the Imam Mahdi and the 72 statements from Obama and the pharaonic claim, and his name Barack also means lightning. Gee, the father of lightning. Who else fell from heaven like lightning? I think what people have got to grasp, Tom, is that this is God saying, open your eyes, my people. And there are people say, I don't want to hear that stuff. Well, I'm telling you this, people who close their eyes end up with something more, probably far more drastic and dangerous than those who go into something with their eyes open and asking God to not only give them the understanding, the wisdom, but also to deliver them from this evil. That's the Lord's prayer. Deliver us from this evil, Lord.
Yeah. And the ultimate fulfillment of the mysticism that is based upon the number 72 and even the prophecies, when you think of it from an Islamic point of view, is a marriage of the religious order and the political order, which of course in the book of Revelation unfolds to us as a marriage of the false prophet and the Antichrist. Now, I'm not taking a cheap shot here at the average Catholic out there that might be listening to this show, but when you think of these alchemical constructs that are in Washington, D.C., that are at the disposal of these magicians operating there on 16th Street, you have two things in the world that are without comparison. The obelisk in St. Peter's Square in Rome, which isn't just any obelisk. It was removed and transferred there from ancient Heliopolis, the city of On in the Bible, and was dedicated to Ra, Osiris, and Isis. And then in Washington, the obelisk that was built by the Freemasons and dedicated to America's first president, which is the tallest of its kind in the world. And Steve, I'm not being crude here, but when it comes to this kind of magic, size matters. There was a reason why this had to be the tallest of its kind. It wasn't just so that it would be the first thing that the rays of Ra would strike as it rose over the capital city. The tallest makes it the most appropriate place, if you will, for the incarnation of what it represents.
Absolutely. And again, I think people need to understand, too, that there were even visible signs in the heavens. Jesus talked about lying signs and wonders. Let's talk about the Norwegian spiral that was so unusual, that was, the matter of probably literally millions of responses on the Internet when the Pharaoh shows up in Norway to receive the Nobel Prize. Remember that?
Yeah.
The spiral. And then the whole thing, too, is that there have been stories of the Anunnaki landing again in Israel at Mount Hermon in the Negev desert, the same place they fell the first time. I mean, David Flynn has done a masterful job at detailing that in his book. So the point being, Tom, is that we're talking about so many events being compressed in time and space, yet as the events are compressed in time and space, now the realm of eternity this war that has been largely kept out of our visible spectrum is now going to be thrown literally before our visible eyes. And that's why I think this is, again, the mercy of God, preparing his people. And I'll say this, just as Moses defeated Pharaoh the first time, so will Jesus through the blood of the Lamb, and people who will stand on his authority defeat him the second time. But it's going to get really bad. I guess we're not even going to have our break, so we can just go from here into 72.
Well, I missed part of what you said, so I'm not sure if we're in a break. I hope we're not.
No, we're not in a break. I said we're just going to skip it and go.
Well, okay. So to tie into what I've said already, with these constructions having been built in Washington, D.C., with the magical practices that take place on 16th Street in the House of the Temple, the Herodome, the headquarters of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry, the raising ceremony that is conducted to bring forth the spirit of Osiris, at least representatively, into every United States president, and all of this heralding toward, and we won't talk about the Great Seal of the United States, but all of this, as you know, pointing forward to what you and I have talked about before, the fulfillment of that prophecy, the Novus Ordo Seclorum, the returning of Apollo Osiris. This Masonic alchemistry, the purpose of it is to reach presidential apotheosis, that is, the leader of the United States, America's Pharaoh, being transformed into a god within the capital dome or womb of Isis in sight of the obelisk of Osiris, just as it was done in ancient Egyptian belief. Now, the number 72 is tied to this. First, let me say, this began with America's first president, and he was a master Freemason, George Washington. In fact, what's also interesting is how Masons in attendance at Washington's funeral in 1799 cast sprigs of acacia, evergreen, upon his body, and the record says they did that to symbolize both Osiris's resurrection in the underworld, that is Washington, and then the imminent resurrection of Osiris into the upper world for his replacement in the next U.S. president. Now, Steve, and you probably have taken heat for this kind of thing in the past, too, and I know that Chris Pinto, our mutual friend, certainly has. People saying that America was built on Christian principles, that Washington, D.C. was laid out on Christian principles, and this whole idea that the dome and the obelisk or any of this other symbolism in Washington, D.C. has something to do with occultism is insulting to a lot of Americans. All I can say is I can't help it. You know,
and all
go
I
to
can
Washington.
Say is, all I can say is the truth is what it is. And again, 99% of evangelicals will not, I mean, maybe they'll entertain it, but they will not accept the fact that Mystery Babylon, the mother of harlots, obviously you would have to have, in order to have the mother of harlots, you'd have to have a child of harlots first. And, you know, I can only say this. I'm sorry if people won't do their own homework, but before they basically castigate you and I and throw rocks at all of us, they better at least show some effort. I get all the time, well, I don't believe that. That's just a bunch of BS. Well, it doesn't matter whether you believe it or not, and I have a new statement. That's the original definition of dud, dumb unto death, or denial unto death, you know? And I know this, somebody says, well, how can you be so smug? Smug? I cry more tears over what's going to happen to this nation and the people in it, and especially the Christians that are still not getting through their head that before they sing the sweet by and by, they better see the handwriting on the wall. Look, Tom, in essence, all of this which has been hidden for the ages, all of this which God has put his redemptive time lock on, that a people wise, and what did Newton say? In the end time, that God would raise up a group of men that will understand the prophecies?
Yeah.
Isn't that a statement? And for what it's worth, our mutual friend Dave Flynn, in what God has given to him and God has given to you, all we have is pieces of the puzzle. But by the grace of God, the picture of the puzzle is coming together with such a rapidity, a speed that has been, let's just say this, as the time is shortened, the speed of the puzzle going together will be equal to that. In other words, we're seeing stuff happen now, day. It's like the staccato, like beat. I mean, this thing is getting ready, forgive me, not getting ready, it's underway. So when people can't understand this, that God can take the most evil machinations and allow a nation to come up with freedom, even behind the scenes, but yet, again, what nation that God raised up didn't turn against him, and he ultimately had to bring it down in judgment? There's not one you can name. There's not one in history you can name. Such is the fate of wickedness when men yield to it.
Yeah. Well, look, I'll say this, and then I'll move on to 72. What I would say to any Christians that disagree with us is visit Washington, D.C., tour the Capitol, Go inside the U.S. Capitol Dome. You'll be inside the womb of ISIS. Inside the Capitol Dome, look upward inside ISIS's continuously pregnant belly, where you'll see the 4,664 square foot fresco called the Apotheosis of George Washington. The word apotheosis means to become a deity, to deify, to become a god. And by the way, it also explains part of the reason why U.S. presidents, military commanders, members of Congress lay in state in the U.S. Capitol Dome, because the womb of ISIS would be where you would go at death to magically reach apotheosis and transform into a god. Those who believe that the United States Capitol was designed on Christianity, and then they go to the dome, they're surprised. You go inside the dome, you look upward at the heaven that George Washington is rising into, and lo and behold, Jesus isn't there, God isn't there, none of the apostles are there, Michael the archangel is not there. You are looking up inside of a pagan heaven. It's occupied not by angels, but with demons, pagan deities. Hermes, Neptune, Venus, which is Isis, Ceres, Minerva, Vulcan. Vulcan is the Roman equivalent of Lucifer, and actually some of Freemasonry's own writers, Manly P. Hall, referred to Vulcan as the god that I forget exactly his language around this, but it was the god who brings the Luciferian fire, in other words, to the hands of the Freemasons. But okay, so be all that what it is, and we're in the second hour now. Besides all of that, kind of stuff that accompanies Washington inside the U.S. Capitol Dome, there is also numerology, and this is where stuff starts getting very occultic and very important. Numerology that is associated with not just the legend of Isis and Osiris, which you can see, encoded in the painting, the 13 maidens and all that relates to that numerology, but the entire scene of the apotheosis of Washington, below which, if you read Apollyon Rising 2012, you find out is a replica of the Aztec calendar stone that ends in the year 2012, but you'll have to read the book to understand why that's the case, of all the millions of things that they could have put inside the history of America beneath this apotheosis. But the apotheosis, here's the important part, and this is one of, there are a few things in Washington, D.C. that are of the most importance. One is the location of the house of the temple. The other is the dome, the Capitol Dome. The other is the location of Baal's Palace, or the obelisk of Osiris. The other, though, and this is when you get into the deep occultism side of this, is when you go inside the belly of ISIS and you look up at the apotheosis of George Washington, and you note, if you're careful, if you're observant, that it is bounded, circularly bounded by a very powerful Pythagorean symbol, a 72 5-pointed starred circle. And actually, each one of these stars are within circles. These are pentagrams. Now, Steve, a lot's been written by historians inside Masonry and outside Masonry about the relevance of this number 72. There's an alchemy that's related to it. First of all, in the Kabbalah, Freemasonry, Jewish apocalyptic writings, the number 72 equals the number of wings that Enoch received when he was transformed into Metatron, the most powerful of all of the angels. Metatron's the angel that can control all the other angels. And Metatron has 72 wings. Now, that's partly important because of the role that Metatron plays to the Brotherhood, also because Metatron is also known as the angel in the whirlwind. This is the angel that George W. Bush, during his administration, enabled as the guiding spirit over America. And we've talked about it before, so we won't rehearse it again, but this spirit was unleashed, literally, to be the controlling spirit. In fact, for those who were in the know and even understood the symbolism of what George Bush was doing, Congressman Major R. Owens of New York, before the House of Representatives on Wednesday, February 28th, 2001, stood up and prayed to the angel in the whirlwind, Metatron, to guide the future and the fate of the United States. People can Google that and look it up. He prayed to the 72-winged angel in the whirlwind, Metatron, to control the future and fate of the United States, which was unleashed during the George Bush administration. Okay, we've done shows on that before, but I mentioned it because it applies here now. But in the context of the Capitol Dome and the 72 stars, pentagrams, occult symbols that circle Washington's apotheosis inside the womb of ISIS, the significance of that symbolism is really more important because in sacred literature, including the Bible, stars are symbols of angels and demons. And within mystical orders, including in Freemasonry, Kabbalism, Gnosticism, 72 is the number of the fallen angels, the cosmocrators, that are currently administering the affairs of the earth. Now stuff starts getting pretty important because experts in the study of the divine council will point out how that beginning at the Tower of Babel, for instance, the world and all of its inhabitants were disinherited by the sovereign God of Israel and placed under the authority of these 72 lesser, or 70 in the original text, and then Gnosticism and mysticism became 72, these beings, angels, who then became corrupt and disloyal to God in their administration of the nations. And usually those who will write about this will refer to Psalms 82 from memory, I believe, where it talks about the angels that come up before God and the divine council. In any case, those beings then become, they fall. And they start being worshipped on earth as gods following Babel. What's interesting, Steve, is that the leaders of these 72 in history become known as Nimrod or Gilgamesh, Osiris, Apollo, all giants who are gatekeepers of these openings, these gateways. Well, consistent inside that tradition, the designers of the U.S. Capitol Dome did three really important and really telling things. Number one, they circled the apotheosis of Washington with 72 pentagrams, stars, circle stars. Secondly, they dedicated the Washington obelisk 72 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And thirdly, they placed 72 stones on the Great Seal's uncapped pyramid in the original pyramid, the one Manly P. Hall wrote about, that forecast the prophecy of the Cumaean Sibyl that prophesied when this god would return. This uncapped pyramid above which actually the eye of Horus, Osiris, Apollo, Gilgamesh, whatever stares. Those three sets of the number 72 form an unholy trinity. And combined with the imagery and occult numerology of, number one, the Osiris obelisk, dedicated in relation to the number 72, the Isis dome with its 72 pentagrams, and the oracular Great Seal with its 72 stones, all of this becomes symbolic of the influence, now, from a Christian point of view, of Satan and his angels over the world. Luke talks about that, I think, in the 4th chapter of Luke. Corinthians talks about it, I think, in the 4th chapter. Ephesians, of course, 6 talks about that. where you even have a prophecy about Satan's final earthly empire, the coming Novus Ordo Seclorum, this new golden pagan age, which is so connected to that 72. But 72, why would it have been included inside the U.S. Capitol Dome? Because 72 has to do with loosing, these pentagrams have to do with loosing and binding, controlling the 72 demons over the earth for the purpose of reestablishing a pagan order on earth, which has been this whole important part of the secret doctrine of the high degree Masonic Illuminatus since its inception. So why 72 pentagrams inside the U.S. Capitol Dome? Because in order for the inevitable worship of Osiris to be reestablished on earth, the 72 demons that govern the nations of the earth have to be controlled. Therefore, they're set in these magical constraints on the Great Seal, the Washington obelisk, the pentagram circles around the apotheosis of Washington. All of this, mystics who are listening to this show know what I'm saying is true. Kabbalists know this is true. This is not a very well hidden secret. Pretty much anybody who wants to spend at least one day verifying what I'm saying can look up the occult meaning behind these symbols and verify that these 72 pentagrams would be for the purpose of binding and forcing the desired effect upon these magistrates, these rulers, these overseers, these watchers. That's actually where the term originally comes from, the watchers, who are overseeing the administration of the earth. Even, again, Manly P. Hall, in The Secret Destiny of America, he talks about the 72 stones of the pyramid on the Great Seal and how they correspond to the 72 arrangements of the Tetragrammaton, the four-lettered name of God in Hebrew, and he even answers his own question. Why would these 72 stones that correspond to the Tetragrammaton, why would they have been included on the Great Seal? And he says it's because it's for controlling. If you use in their mysticism the 72 combinations of the name of God, it results in the Shem Hamforish, which then can control the powers, the energies of nature, the spirits that are operating behind it. So you have this idea that the mystical name of God, of all things, could be invoked to bind, to loose these supernatural agents, these 72 powers. And that's the reason why you got these 72 stars, pentagram shapes around the deified Freemason George Washington. Then in addition to that, you mentioned a moment ago the Goetia. You have these magical medieval books of magic, and these are really important to those Freemasons.
Let me say one thing, too, and this before you go on, I want to stop you just at this point and insert something. It's critical, okay?
Yes.
If everything that we're saying is so critical, I want to put everybody into perspective. The reason that I'm trying to get people to turn their hearts over to Jesus, because all of the authority, all of the submission, all the principalities, powers, archons, everything that's out there, Jesus said the most amazing statement. You know it as a pastor in Scripture. Behold, I give you power to tread on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you. The reason I'm saying is I'm getting a bunch of people saying, well, what's the use? How can we fight this stuff? We're trying to give everybody, and I need to say this at this point, an understanding that what you have in Jesus, through the blood of Jesus, through your relationship with Jesus, through your redemption, through the power of God, to as many as receive him, Jesus, God gave them, you, me, us, the power to become the sons of God. All of this stuff, it doesn't matter. Principalities, powers, spiritual wickedness in many places. There's one name that is above all name, and that's the name of Jesus. And if you can grasp that, those of you that are sending me your fear-driven diatribes and crying as Christians, you need to take this to Jesus, because it's time for the meat of the word. Milk will not suffice, and that is the greatest promise I know that Jesus gave. He said all authority in heaven had been given to him, and he gives it to the believers. But you know what, Tom? the believers don't want to use their authority, so they just basically become victims to an authority that has been taken from them, and God wants to rightly reestablish. I had to say that at this point in the broadcast.
Hey, well, that's fine. And Steve, I'm actually glad you broke in and said that, because I would not want anybody to believe that what I'm saying about what the occultists have planned is the ultimate scenario. We're all going to go down in flames because this is what they have planned. But look, the Bible prophesies the coming of the Antichrist. This is the Bible that prophesies that this will happen. But the ultimate end game is that we prevail. The church is the power against which the gates of hell will not prevail. We are the returning victorious army that overthrows all of this darkness. So all we're saying is the powers of darkness have a plan. It is incorporated within the most powerful city in the United States of America, and so what are you going to do about it? What you do about it is you become preachers of the gospel. This is the power of God. In fact, this book that Nita and I are writing right now, Spiritual Warfare and the Coming Singularity, the whole last section, the last 3 chapters, are dedicated to the other sign of the days of Noah. Because when we talk about the sign of the days of Noah, we almost always talk about the return of the Nephilim upon the earth, right? But there was another sign of the days of Noah, and that was how the covenant people of God were the only power on earth. A young David with his sling. It doesn't matter if it's a child with a sling or an adult. We are the power against which this transhumanist, biotechnological, whatever it is, a spiritual force, this watcher's presence that wants to bring forth the incarnation of massive evil upon the earth in the presence of the Nephilim and the Raphaim, rising up from the dead and being incarnated in a last days army at Armageddon. Well, go read the end of the book. The army at Armageddon loses to us. So the point about bringing this issue up is to make people aware of the times in which we are living. People are blessed by even reading the book of Revelation and trying to understand the times in which we live. Jesus wouldn't have provided an answer to his disciples saying,